Okay, everybody, so here it is, a fairly detailed discussion of the design and workings of an off-grid solar system. I've been pretty hesitant to do a video like this for a long time because I'm sure I'm going to get ripped to shreds by a bunch of people who know a lot more about this stuff than I do. So if you're a solar expert and you're watching this, please be kind. A couple of caveats before I start this. I am not a solar expert. I am not an electrical expert, but I've had my own system for a couple of years now, and I've observed it, and I've read a lot, and I've watched a lot of videos. So what you're going to see here is my attempt to describe for a friend of mine, Taylor, the design and workings of my solar system and largely any off-grid solar system. I try to keep it generic in places. The idea is so that he can think about how he wants to structure and build his own solar system for the future. So that's what this is. There's obviously a lot of information out there on the internet about all of this stuff, but me personally, when I looked, I just didn't find the things I wanted at the level I wanted to kind of get me going. So luckily I had somebody to build my system for me. Thank you, Derek and Liam. But it wasn't until I had my system for quite a while and got to observe it that things started to make a little more sense when I put it together with some of the things that I was finding on the internet. So this is my attempt to kind of put it at a level where if you want either to understand these things better or you want your own and you just don't know where to start, or some of the things you've seen have been at too high a level or too low a level for it to really kind of sink in, this is at the level that I believe that I wanted when I was searching for that information. So that's what I'm trying to do here. As I said before, I'm not an expert. I probably will explain some things, that the technical details of some of this stuff, I might be off a little bit here and there. Hopefully not so much that the concept that I'm trying to explain, is lost. I think at some level, everything I'm saying here is true and accurate, but I may get some details wrong. And by all means, if I get some things wrong and you want to point them out, go ahead. But hopefully it doesn't invalidate kind of the discussion. I don't think it should. But this first part, this will probably be in a couple of parts. This first part is to try and discuss kind of end to end the pieces that are involved. What pieces you're going to have, what big ticket items, what big components you're going to have in, I believe, just about any off-grid solar system. And kind of how they fit in, where they go, kind of in the order of the way things work, and what each of their functions is at some level. So that's what we're trying to do here with this first one. So let's jump into it.
Mine was at Home Depot and it was like $3.
I'll try and go.
It's kind of a piece of crap.
All right, just walk in front of that. Let's go.
Hi, I'm Brian.
So I'll try and go in order. And again, I'm going to talk about everything. If you know it already, that's fine. If you don't know it, that's fine. If you have a question, stop me and ask.
Okay.
So this is high level. I'm going to try and go in the order. So first thing obviously is the panels, which we'll look at out there. So my panels are 305 watt panels. I think that's fairly typical nowadays. Obviously, a long time ago, panels were typically maybe 100 watts or whatever. Mine are 300 watt panels. They're getting more than that now, but that's a pretty good basic number that panels are around 300-ish watts.
Okay.
I currently am running on 6 of them. I'd like to add 9 more and be running on 15.
What's the average lifetime of the panel?
I believe that number is around, it's either 10 or 20 years, which is a big difference, but it's at least 10. I think it's 10 to 20.
Do they have a warranty?
They have a warranty. Ooh, I wish I knew how much mine is.
That's
but I don't
something
know.
to check.
And they will. It's not like they'll just go from working to not working, right? They degrade over time, and I mean the weather kind of beats them up and stuff. So they will diminish over time, and produce a little less of their capacity over time. But it's at least kind of 10 years, and I think the number might be really 20 years before you might have to think about actually replacing the panels. Mm-hmm. So it's not forever, but it's a good while.
Okay.
So my panels happen to cost, they were brand new, they happen to cost about $200 give or take. I think I've written down $220 per panel. They were brand new. You can definitely find them for a lot cheaper, especially used.
Our buddy Dave, he's getting his panels for about $100 a pop, and they're almost the same exact panels I have. So you can definitely do better than that. I bought all mine brand spanking new, not entirely necessary, but that's what they are. So I'm living on, theoretically, 300 times 6. I'm living on 1,800, 1.8 kilowatts of the system.
Okay.
I'd like to go to the 15 panels, which times 300 would be 4,500. So 4.5 kilowatt system is what it's capable of producing. Now, there are a lot of other little things that can affect that number that we'll talk about as we go, but in theory, 4,500 kilowatts I can take from the sun at any given time. Okay, so panels come first. You run the wires from your panels, you connect your panels however you connect your panels. We'll talk about that, the different ways you can do it, series, parallel, all that, to get certain voltages in your system.
Yeah.
But just generically, you connect those panels into a combiner box, because you've got basically either individual panels or strings of panels that you create. You run all those wires, and it's a bunch of wires.
Yeah.
So when you want to run it into the next device,
Yeah.
which we'll talk about in a second, you want one set of wires. So the combiner box combines your panels. So all into one set of wires,
everything
and it
goes
brings all
into the
kind of the
combiner.
power together. Yeah, it's a simple little box. It's really just wires in, hitting bus bars, wires out. But the idea is you can bring in a bunch of wires. They hit those bus bars. There's breakers in there to protect things.
Yeah.
But what comes out basically is one set of wires. So it's basically like now you've created one giant panel, and there's just one wire, one set of wires coming from it, a positive and a negative and a ground, to go to your next piece. Your next piece after the combiner box is the charge controller, because you can't just send the energy that your panels collect straight into a battery or a set of batteries, because that energy is all over the place, right? It's dirty. It's at different levels all the time, and that's not a good way to charge a battery. You want a nice kind of steady. You want things cleaned up a little bit.
It's like a conditioner.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's what the charge controller does. It controls the charge to the batteries. So that comes after the combiner box.
So that protects the batteries.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
It is. It controls the energy and sends it to the batteries in a way that the batteries will like.
Okay.
We talked combiner box. Combiner box. I have a 6 kind of space combiner box. Turns out I'm currently feeding it with 2 strings, so I really only need 2 spaces. When I will be ultimately going to 5 strings of 3. We'll talk about how they're put together, but so I'll use 5 of those spaces. It's a 6 space. And when I say space, that's kind of how many sets of wires you can bring in and put a breaker, and then one set of wires goes out.
Okay.
So that combiner box is around $100. It's not a high dollar item or anything, but it does what it does. Charge controller comes after that. This is a pretty decent. I've got mine at $550. Charge controller. They make different sizes of them. Mine is, and there's different styles. You might have heard some of these terms: MPPT. What's the other? Pulse width modulation, PWM. There's different ways. So the other thing that the charge controller does, like I said, it makes the power kind of. It provides it to the batteries in a way that the batteries will like. Mm-hmm. It's all about kind of optimizing how much it can get from the panel. So MPPT stands for, oh gosh, I should know what that stands for. Maximum Power Point Tracking. So there's all these graphs of how the energy looks and everything, and how much power is being provided depending on whether a cloud comes over the sun and all this stuff. And the idea is this thing is always kind of watching where the energy is and always kind of picking optimal points to kind of be able to feed the most power it can at any given time to the batteries. So
it's like a monitor.
Yes.
It monitors it.
MPPT, to my knowledge, is kind of the most advanced or most
it's the best.
Yeah, I think it is the best.
Okay.
Some of those others now they have their uses, I'm sure, and there are probably cases where you can get away with some of the others.
Yeah.
But as far as I understand it, this is kind of the best, and it is what you want if you want nice, clean power and
MPPT.
So, mine is a 6150. That's 60 amps, 150 volts is what it can do. So that's a pretty decent priced item. I have $550.
What's an amp?
a measure. So yeah, general electricity, watts is power. Watts equals volts times amp. West Virginia is the way I remember it. Watts equals volts times amps. I literally say West Virginia in my head so that I will remember that equation.
Oh wow,
all the
that's
time.
great.
Somebody else gave me that one time, and I've always just held on to it. Watts equals volts times amps. So watts is power. Watts is the big number. The beauty of that equation of volts times amps, what it tells you is you can actually play with those numbers in the way and this plays into the way you connect your panels, whether they're in series or in parallel. Same thing with your batteries,
Yeah.
whether you connect them in series or parallel. It's all a game to try to produce power, but produce it at a level in volts and amps that your equipment can handle. So for example, my charge controller, my MPPT 6150,
Yeah.
can take can do 60 amps, 150 volts. So you want to play with you want to set up your panels and your batteries in such a way that you stay within those parameters of 60 amps and 150 volts, but yet you can take one of them and make it a little higher and take the other one and make it a little lower or whatever, but still produce, because they're multiplied to produce power. You're still getting the most power
So
you can
what's
get.
the maximum voltage you can get?
150. So we'll talk about what that means when we talk about the panels.
Yeah.
So panels, combiner box puts them together, feeds to the charge controller. The charge controller's job is to pretty up the power that goes to the batteries. The batteries are next.
Right.
My batteries happen to be Tesla batteries. They're lithium ion. I tend to think, kind of like I said about the charge controller, there's lots of battery technology out there. In my opinion, lithium ion is one of the best, if not the best.
Yeah.
A lot of people use kind of golf cart batteries, the big heavy,
Yeah.
they can either be sealed lead acid or whatever, some flooded lead acid. Some of those require a lot of maintenance. You have to be checking the water and the electrolyte and all this stuff, much like
Yeah.
you would for a car battery or things like that. They're big and heavy. Again, they have their uses. A lot of people use them, but some of the drawbacks that I know of are a lead acid battery generally can only be discharged to 50% of its capacity.
Right.
So whatever
what I
capacity
thought,
it has, you really can only use half of that before you have to fill it back up. If
Yeah.
you go below half of that, you start to harm that battery and shorten its lifespan and all that stuff. So essentially, if you use lead acid batteries, you can only use half of what's there. With a lithium ion battery, you can discharge it to 20% of its capacity. So you can take it way down. You can use 80%. You can take it down to 20. So no battery that I know of do you really want to kind of discharge to zero. But like I said, the lead acid batteries you can only take to about half. The lithium ion you can take to 20%. You can take them pretty low before you have to charge them back up. So that's kind of nice. They also will go through a lot more cycles than, I forget what the actual numbers are, but they can cycle
So
a lot
they've
more
got a longer
times than
lifetime.
so they should have a longer lifespan. Those batteries, I have Tesla batteries. A lot of people use electric car batteries. They also make specific, I think Dave has some specific solar lithium ion batteries for solar farms and things like that. I think that's what Dave's using. But it's very common in systems, especially systems that people build themselves, to use car batteries. So Nissan Leaf, Chevy Volt. Bill uses Chevy Volt batteries. I use Tesla batteries. Derek's using Tesla batteries. So very common. They're pretty expensive. That's another high dollar item. Those are anywhere. My Tesla batteries are anywhere from $1,200 to $1,500 depending on where you find them. I have 4 of them. So that's a big chunk of the cost right there. It's actually more than the panels, is the batteries.
Yeah.
Obviously the batteries' purpose is to store.
Yeah.
So during the day, when sun's coming in, you can, within reason, you can do kind of whatever you want with it, right? And you can almost use to your heart's content, especially here in Arizona with all the sun we get.
Yeah.
The batteries are there for once the sun starts to go down and it goes nighttime and you need heat or air overnight or you need to run a device, obviously you need batteries. So you only need enough battery storage, in theory, to get you from sundown to sun up. And I'm oversimplifying it greatly, but once the sun comes back up, you've got the sun again, and you can do kind of whatever you want. Now there's some lag time for things to fill up, and the sun rises in the sky, and it's not giving you a ton early, but it gives you more later. But that's really what the batteries are there for, and cloudy days. we're lucky here in Arizona. You know, we don't get hit a lot. Now, we definitely do get our cloudy days, but we don't get as much of other places. So it's not so much to really get you multiple days. It's really about getting from the night to the day. Obviously, if you do get, you know, especially during monsoon season, if you get a day of clouds or a couple of days of clouds, what I like to think is, you know, if you built your system to really handle that case, you know, you'd be adding panels and or, you know, other equipment and or more batteries or whatever, and you'd be building your system bigger and more robust to handle that, which is all nice, but that all costs money, of course. So to me, the better solution to that problem, which in our case happens very rarely, that you really need to survive a day, 2 days, 3 days or whatever without really getting any energy, to me the better solution is a backup plan that where really you don't expect your system to produce that much, because to build your system to handle that problem you have to add a lot of money.
Yeah.
But to be able to handle that problem with a backup, like say a generator, to me is a lot simpler and cheaper solution. So to me, I'm not necessarily building. I didn't build my system to handle that horrible scenario that doesn't happen very often. Right. I said when that problem happens, if I have to kick on a generator, that's what I'll do, and it only happens once in a great while, so that's fine by me. Because if you built your system to handle that, you'd be putting in a lot of extra money that you only need once in a while. So that's my personal opinion on how your system has to be built and sized. I think here in Arizona we're lucky. You can pretty much size it for your daily use. Maybe you oversize a little bit, but I don't think you have to greatly oversize thinking that, well, what if I get a week of clouds? Well, that's going to happen once a year or, you know, whatever. So that's my personal opinion on that. So energy goes into the batteries. In between, there's a piece of equipment in here that in my system is called an E-panel. In some other systems, it might be called a power distribution panel. It's really just a middle ground as you go from one piece of equipment to another. It's a place for wires to land and maybe land on a bus bar and then go out to a different spot, because maybe 2 wires need to become one or something like that.
So where does that happen?
It's just another panel and we'll look at the system. It's physically, it's kind of in between. It's in the middle of all the devices. Okay. And it's just a nice landing spot. It's also a space to put protection, like breakers and things like that. Right. So we'll see that. I don't really talk about it because in terms of the electricity flowing through the system, it's not really in terms of the concept. It doesn't serve a function other than maybe protection, but it's just kind of there, okay. And a lot of the stuff flows through it, and you can add breakers and things for protection. But it's another, you know, I've got it at $400 in my system. It's a good sized device and it costs some money. But that's a spot, every system will have one of those, because as you flow, I'm talking about when I say you'll go from the charge controller to the batteries, then you'll go from the batteries, our next stop is the inverter. You don't really go straight between each of those things. You actually run into that E-panel, you hit a bar, you hit a breaker or whatever, and then you flow on to the next thing. So the E-panel is there as a landing spot and as a protection point for a lot of things. Okay. So just be aware that that's a stop along the way, and we'll see it in the system. But conceptually, after the batteries, the power goes to the inverter. The inverter, so up to this point, everything I've been talking about has been DC electricity, direct current. Yeah. Direct current, one direction, makes a path, right? Electrons flow in one direction and make a path. So the inverter, so I've been talking about DC electricity up to this point. The inverter, and obviously, except for a few things, in a trailer there are some DC devices. In a house, if you want, you can put in some DC devices. A lot of people, earthships, they use DC fridges, things like that. Sure.
Before you go into the inverter, and you've got DC, can you take a feed from that DC and bypass the inverter and go to a DC piece of equipment?
I believe you could. Right. I believe you would, probably, yes. Yes. If you wanted to run, now, I should, of course, send another, there's another caveat here that I am not an expert at all this stuff. I'll tell you the way I understand it. I think if you were going to run a DC device, whether it be a fan, a pump, a fridge, I think at that point you would basically just come straight from the battery. Now you might stop at a breaker. You might go into that E-panel even, and you might stop at a breaker just to protect something or whatever. But you obviously wouldn't need to convert that electricity to AC. So yes, you would, in theory, in
so
concept,
from the E-panel, there'd
you
be
would come-
some way of going from there into a socket, a sort of
yeah,
housing?
you'd run a wire through a conduit to wherever you needed it to be, and
Okay.
yeah, sure.
Okay.
So yes, that's how you would. I don't feed anything, even though typical RV has several DC devices in it. An RV has what's called a converter, which actually, when you're plugged into shore power, which is AC, 120 volt here in America, there are devices in your RV that run on DC. The converter, not inverter, converter, and it's usually kind of under your sink or something, depends on the RV, but it actually will provide DC power to certain devices.
Right.
So it essentially does that. Which I suppose is another thing you could do. Although in each of these conversions there's loss, right? So you wouldn't want to, like you said, you would want to break directly off the battery at that point and go to something, because you wouldn't want to convert it to AC and then feed it somewhere and convert it back to DC or whatever. There's loss every time you do that. So I don't plan on running any DC devices in my house. Some people do because they say that they're more efficient.
That's what I heard. Yeah.
But I'm sure that is true.
You told me that it doesn't travel very far, very easily.
Correct. DC. If you research the history of electricity and the whole Tesla versus Edison, DC versus AC battle that they had back in the day, I think one of the main reasons, I'm sure there are other reasons too, but one of the main reasons that AC won out is it's better at traveling great distances. DC, when it travels distances, there's a lot more loss. So you generally, as you're building a system, that's also something you want to keep in mind. When you're, everything I described of the energy from the panels going to the combiner box, going from the combiner box to the charge controller, you want to keep those runs as short as possible, because that is DC electricity, and there will be loss over a long run. And the only way to fight that loss is to provide a bigger and bigger cable. Generally, the bigger the cable you give, the less loss there is. So what happens is, if you want to travel a great distance, to reduce that loss, you might have to buy a really big cable, and really big cables are really expensive. So generally you want to, for those runs from panel to combiner box to charge controller, you want to keep those things pretty close together, as close as you can. Once you convert that energy to AC, it's a lot simpler to have it travel a distance. Now, you still have loss, and you still have to account for that loss by sizing cable appropriately, but AC is better at it than DC. AC travels better than DC. So after you come out of, so you send the power from the batteries to the inverter converts it to AC, and again, with maybe a stop in the E-panel for breakers or whatnot, it leaves your system, your electrical generation system, and it goes to wherever you, now it's a load, and it can go wherever you want. You can feed sockets, lights, receptacles, whatever you might want to do. So again, at a high level, in generic terms, that's how a system will flow. That's almost any solar system that's completely off grid. I talked about batteries and whatnot. If it was grid tied, there'd be some different things in there, but a kind of a standalone off-grid system, with I think very few exceptions, they kind of have to go through, they kind of have to have those components, and they kind of flow in that order. That's a little generic. There's obviously a lot of nuances, I'm sure, to every little system, but that is a basic flow of electricity through an off-grid system, and you kind of need all those things because they all do a job that you require. So obviously there's a million different components to choose from to fulfill those needs, but you need those needs. So I think that covers the layout of a system.
Cool.